Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Rader, Director of Engagement and Membership here at AGU. Welcome to this Global Environmental Change section, a centennial webinar. Before we get started, and before we introduce our speaker today, I want to go ahead and let you know that this webinar will be recorded. Will be up on our website for later viewing. We will take questions at the end of the webinar. You can post your question using the dashboard that you have in front of you. We can save the question and ask it later, or later if you hang on and you're on your phone or on your computer, you can actually be unmuted to ask your question on the mic. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce the current president of the Global Environmental Change section, Phil Mote.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm Phil Mote, and this is the fourth of 4 webinars that the Global Environmental Change section has put on to celebrate AGU's centennial. I want to thank Rob from AGU headquarters and Yuan Rao, an early career rep at the Global Environmental Change section, for helping us put on these 4 webinars. Global environmental change is part of the Earth covering neighborhood, which includes a number of sections that focus on the various aspects of the surface of the Earth, and we're one of what used to be focus groups in that we're cross-cutting. On Tuesday of the fall meeting, the Centennial Theater will feature the Earth covering neighborhood, so I urge everybody to look at the rich array of offerings that we have lined up for that day and consider attending some or all of those if you're in San Francisco. Our section is very broad. We have people who look at paleoclimate stuff, people who look at numbers from GCMs, but we also think about the human dimension. And so we're really pleased for our final webinar to really bring the human dimension into it. We had a little bit of that during our first one about drought in the Southwest. But Julie Silva is our speaker today. She's an associate professor of geographical sciences at the University of Maryland. She focuses on economic geography, globalization, uneven development, global justice, and the human dimensions of global change. So thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's taking the time to watch this presentation. It's my first webinar, so I'm excited to be doing it, and we'll see how it goes. And the title of my talk is Climate Change and Inequality, Distributional Impacts and Dynamic Vulnerabilities. And as was just mentioned, I focus on economic geography and poverty and inequality specifically, but it's really impossible to study either poverty or inequality today or even in the recent past without addressing issues of climate change. And if you leave it out of interviews, or at least I found that the times that I didn't include it in interviews early on, like in the early 2000s, the people that I was interviewing would bring it up, right? I do a lot of interviews with semi-subsistence farmers, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And so over time, I've become increasingly interested in climate change and begun to study it. And so before I begin talking about the topic, I would just like to quickly acknowledge and thank my collaborators on this project, and it's largely an intellectual project. We talk a lot about this, and we write some, but we talk even more. Robin Lyshenko at Rutgers, and Jen Chaffer at the University of Maryland. Robin is also an economic geographer, and Jen is an environmental anthropologist. And really, this project that we're doing, examining the relationships between climate change and inequality, climate vulnerability, is not. Our interest in the topic, I think, is not unique. There's a lot of attention being given to this relationship, a lot of reflections on it, mainly in the media, policy arenas, gray literature. These are just some of the report covers that I was able to find. But there's really, I would say, limited empirical evidence to help us understand how the relationship works. And we know surprisingly little about the strength of the association between climate change inequality, climate vulnerability, and inequality. And so what I'm going to be doing today is going over the literature and talking a little bit about some of my research, but really discussing broadly, what we do know and kind of the way that these types of investigations are trending towards in the future. So I like to frame all of my research projects as if they were destined to be in a mystery novel, because I love mystery novels, and it helps keep me really, like, you know, excited about it. So the mystery in this case is, why is it so difficult to quantify the relationship between inequality and climate vulnerability? And, you know, despite extensive scholarly efforts to explain growing economic inequalities, the relationship between distributional disparities and climate change has really resulted in surprisingly little quantitative empirical investigation. And when investigating this relationship myself, I find that inequality is a very elusive villain, if we're going to keep using the terms, right, of the mystery novel. Lots of frustrating findings, I mean, for myself and people that I've worked with on this, counterintuitive findings, no statistically significant associations. I mean, and this, I think, is familiar to anybody who does, you know, econometrics, spatial econometric analyses. But for something that, you know, seems so intuitive, and I'll talk a little bit about, like, theoretical relationships on this, it's quite, I don't know, it's perplexing. It's a paradox, I think, that the metrics that we have to use to actually, you know, quantify the relationship and assess the strength prove to be, you know, that knowledge proves to be so elusive. So the outline of today's presentation, really quickly going over some conceptual distinctions with the terms I'm going to be using, then discussing the theoretical relationships, what we expect to find when we go, when we take these theories to the data. And then the empirical evidence thus far. And I should say too that, the empirical evidence that we're looking at today is just a brief, like, slice, right? A small slice of the overall research, but I'm focusing on work that I find to be particularly compelling. And then a synthesis of what we know theoretically and empirically, and then a discussion of future research needs. All right, so the key concepts. First, vulnerability, as we're discussing it, or as it's being used by me today, is a predisposition or susceptibility to being harmed by a climate event or circumstance, right? And this is in part, about exposure to the event, also the ability to adapt or cope, right? To cope with or adapt to these events. And then poverty refers to a state or condition in which an individual or group lacks the resources and essentials for a minimum standard of living. Usually poverty in the literature that I'm going to be discussing today is implicitly economic, and sometimes even explicitly about economic poverty or monetary poverty, financial deprivation, right? But there is a consensus, particularly within the development literature and development economics, economic geography, that poverty is really a multidimensional experience. So there's economic aspects to it, but then there's a lot of psychological and social aspects as well. And then inequality is referring to disparities in the distribution of economic or social assets. So even though poverty and inequality are both viewed as negative, and they should be, they're different and they're distinct, and we'll discuss it a bit. But poverty is the state or condition where you lack the resources and essentials for a minimum standard of living, and the minimum obviously varies. And equality is referring to the gap between the people who have, right, the people who don't have a particular asset. And so, inequality among millionaires is problematic in some regards, but not nearly as problematic as inequality where you have millionaires and then you have people, very impoverished people in the same distribution. Okay, so the connections between poverty and vulnerability have been discussed quite a bit, and they stem from both greater exposure of poor populations and more limited capacity to adapt. And so there's been quite a bit of work that looks at this vicious cycle, a lot of good evidence to support it. And so what you see is that poor individuals are more likely to live in areas that are highly exposed to climate extremes, such as tropical cyclones and floods, and people are familiar with Planet of Slums by Mike Davis. He does a lovely job, right, of talking about kind of, the reason why slums are always in part of it when he talks about slum ecology, like why slums are so environmentally vulnerable, why they locate in those types of regions. In the context of the global South, poorer people tend to have livelihoods that are more dependent on climate-sensitive sectors, agriculture, pastoralism, and fishing. Anywhere in the world, really, when you're talking about people in economic poverty, you're talking about people who have fewer financial assets to help them recover from a climate shock, right? People who are less likely to have insurance, and people who often lack knowledge or access to the knowledge and information about adaptation, right? And beyond economic factors, right, when we talk about physical health and psychological dimensions of poverty, we see higher levels of illness, mental stress, and other burdens also can hinder the capacity of poor individuals or disadvantaged individuals to respond effectively to climate stresses, right? So this is something that we know, and this provides some of the foundation, because I've done previous work with Robin, for example, on this, where we move into, or where we arrive on the scene of what we're going to be talking about or focusing on today. And this is a review of the theoretical relationship between inequality and climate vulnerability. So given that disproportionate climate exposure and limited adaptive capacity make poor and marginalized populations more vulnerable to climate-related shocks, these should also have the potential to exacerbate existing structural inequalities and advantages. And so the theoretical work on this is quite good, and it's been, it's been developed, right? The theories have been built over, a decent amount of time, and so, there's been reflection upon them and re-theorizing. And what you see is that the theoretical examinations of this human dimension of global change often conceptualize inequality as both a cause and a consequence of differential climate vulnerability. And so what you're getting is this multi-directional relationship, but each direction operates a little bit differently, or is theorized, I should say, right, to operate a little bit differently. So on one hand, climate vulnerability is viewed as a function, right, or is created by socially constructed inequalities of resource entitlement and access. And on the other hand, differential vulnerability to climate change itself exacerbates already existing inequalities in the aftermath of a climate shock, right? So the first relationship in purple, where you have inequality contributing to greater climate vulnerability, we're going to call this root causality later as we go through the presentation. And then the reverse relationship with climate vulnerability exacerbating inequality, that's triggered by a climate shock. And we call this feedback causality, right? So initial distributional gaps between the better off and the worse off individuals or groups, right, are going to contribute to differential vulnerability to climate change. And feedback processes then result in subsequent inequality after a climate-related shock. And so really, if I had the prowess to do the diagram, as I think it really should be, you'd see this with every completed cycle getting a little bit bigger, right, kind of expanding outward. So first, we'll take root causality, where inequality is hypothesized or theorized to increase climate vulnerability. And here what we're talking about is power. And this is one of the big differences when you're looking at inequality versus poverty. Even if you're just, if you're using a proxy or a metric, right? A metric looking at poverty, I think, let me phrase it that the metrics of inequality, implicit in these metrics is saying something about power and power discrepancies, right? Power asymmetries that lead to institutional arrangements that prioritize the powerful at the expense of the rest, right? One of the reasons that people have found inequality to be detrimental, like regardless of, the poor, even if the poorest member of the population is not that poor, right? If there's a big gap between, that individual, the group that individual belongs to, and the wealthiest group, or the group that has like the best distribution, the most of that asset, it's still problematic because of the ways that inequality has like influences social arrangements, institutional arrangements, and I'll talk a bit more about them as we move through. So the root causal relationship is involving social, economic, and political processes and the interactions between them, right, by which inequalities contribute to climate vulnerability or vulnerability to climate change, right? So differences in vulnerability arise as power asymmetries, right, lead to kind of different priorities, right? Some certain groups, individuals being prioritized more than others. And the vulnerability enhancing aspects of inequality has, a clear socioeconomic dimension, right? Since economic wealth often translates into political power, the political pathways linking inequality directly to vulnerability receive considerable emphasis in the literature. And this is one of the reasons why I think that, studies of economic inequality are very important. So when you're looking at an economic inequality measure, captured in that as well, right, is something, about like the power dynamics, I would argue. Although, it's not explicit, right, and this would be more kind of the interpretive lens, right, that you would bring to the results. But, early theorists of this relationship and environmental hazards identified good governance as the most important factor in reversing root causes of vulnerability, right? So given that inequality has been found to lead to, skewed governance, you can see that it could also, right, have that relationship with inequality. So when we look at the pathways, how inequality leads to greater climate vulnerability, right? The hypothesized, theorized pathways has this capture of political power by the wealthy and a corresponding erosion of social cohesion and decreasing collective support for state-sponsored safety nets. And then part of this too is skewed policies, ultimately leaving disadvantaged groups more exposed and susceptible to shocks, and resulting in uneven access to public resources, so infrastructure, early warning systems, right? All of that can be considered public resources. So part of this story is that certain people, as they become wealthier and like more disengaged, and this is part of like I think the general discourse that we're seeing now on inequality, right? In this new gilded era that we're living in, is that as people become like increasingly polarized along wealth dimensions or other measures of advantage, you see that the very wealthy can opt out, right, and use private resources, and then become public resources become like less available, right, because there's lack of like kind of a willingness to fund them. Okay, so feedback causality is the reverse aspect of this relationship, and so here's where we're getting differential vulnerability amplifying existing inequalities when a shock or shocks trigger the need for coping and adaptation strategies. So first you have certain people, the poorer parts of the population, being disproportionately exposed, right, because of inequality, right? So you have this differential climate vulnerability. When the shock happens, right, it triggers the need to cope, and they have less resources with which to cope, right? And so that means that they disproportionately lose, right? If you're thinking about economic inequality, so they have like large economic losses, proportional to what assets they have, right? And so that further erodes the floor, right? And so you get the gap widening. And so the climate vulnerability to inequality pathway, right, is theorized, after a climate shock occurs, that you have this disproportionate loss of assets and income, disadvantaged individuals, groups, and here kind of I fall into the same kind of pattern of using assets and income, which is more associated with economic inequality. But you could also think about, if you want to think about educational inequality, disproportionate loss of educational facilities, damaged educational facilities for disadvantaged individuals and groups, right? So it does carry over to consideration of social inequality. Then there's also elite capture of relief assistance intended for the most disadvantaged, that this can happen. You can also see a breakdown of patronage systems and decline in moral obligations. So in cases where maybe climate change, everyone incurs a loss, let's say, but the wealthier incur less of a loss, still it's a loss, right? And this can lead to kind of a breakdown in their willingness, to provide assistance, voluntary assistance to poor segments of the population. And what you get is a further widening of gaps in well-being, right? So with this, we have cumulative effects. And so these are just two graphics that I've done to try and show rapid onset events you can think of as, I guess, a flood, right? And a gradual onset, think of a drought, right? And here alpha denotes the wealthiest quintile, whereas delta is denoting the poorest quintile, okay? And so in the rapid onset case, the way that the theory is laid out, you'll have a climate shock and a drop in assets. And in this case, the wealthiest and the poorest all experience a drop, right? But the drop result is more pronounced for the poorest, right? And then you have a second shock coming, right? And either further drop for both groups, but again, more so for the poorest. And this just keeps continuing after every shock until you see like and the gap is widening progressively throughout. graduate onset and drought, this is something that takes, it's not a sudden drop, right? But it's a, kind of a steady decline, right, during the period of the shock. So here you see the start of a first shock, the end of a first shock. You see a start of a second shock, an end of a second shock, right? But it results in the same thing, this dramatic increase in the gap between, the haves and the have-nots. But I think it's important to conceptualize like how, in theory, this should work in the case of rapid onset and gradual onset, because when we get to the empirical literature, you do see differences in findings, right? And the strength of the association between climate change, climate vulnerability, and inequality. It varies by what type of shock you're looking at, whether it's gradual or whether it's rapid, right? They're both bad, and theoretically they end up, with the same outcome, but it operates differently, right? So examining the evidence. Although existing studies provide some evidence in support of a vicious cycle whereby inequalities exacerbate climate vulnerability and differential vulnerability results in more skewed distributions over time, it's difficult to really assess the strength, statistical significance of these relationships or generalize because the body of literature remains quite small. And the studies that we do have employ many different types of statistical methods and inequality metrics. Also, they're conducted at different scales of analysis. Some are looking at urban areas, others rural areas, others kind of global. And that limits our ability to compare results across studies. And moreover, the multidimensional nature of inequality is widely acknowledged, but still studies are focusing almost exclusively on economic inequality. And so, this provides, some issues, right, with what we're going to be looking at. But what does exist, the evidence that does exist, I think, is illuminating, right, and definitely merits, discussion. So a little bit about the methods kind of for each, or the approaches taken for the studies that are assessing one direction or the other. And that's another thing about the studies. Really, there's very few studies that are looking at both directions of causality, right? But there are, so we lump the studies that we're looking at and the studies that we conduct ourselves, right, into two camps. Some look at root causality, and in these cases, you often see regression or multivariate approaches being taken where there's some sort of proxy for vulnerability, and that's being modeled as a function of an inequality measure and other factors, right? So the characteristics of the vulnerability proxies vary. They're often composite indices constructed from socioeconomic and biophysical variables. So a suite of variables being put into an index, which makes it often a little bit, in terms of interpreting the findings, a little difficult. In some cases, though, you have outcome variables. So it would be like disaster-related fatalities or, economic loss, right, following an event. The characteristics of inequality measures, the traditional measures of economic inequality are indexes like the Gini index, the Atkinson index, sometimes, and then there's others as well, right? Sometimes, rarely, you see an index measure being used to capture social or resource access inequities. So, there's been some interesting studies on educational inequality, inequities of land holdings, land access, livestock ownership, and the like. And these are put, the Gini index can look at the distributional gaps, right, really, in any type of, or in a lot, I should say, right, in a lot of conditions. So it doesn't have to be economic or a lot of goods. And there's other variables that are included in these analyses, and there's a considerable variation in what people control for, but they often include a level, an income level or a poverty rate of some sort. And part of this is when you're explicitly trying to see how inequality contributes to vulnerability, climate vulnerability, you want to be able to say that this is like a distinct contribution from what poverty would do anyway. And, there's very good, and robust empirical work showing that poverty does increase climate vulnerability, right? But does, in addition, what does inequality do, right? And how strong is that association? And so that's what we're going to be looking at when we look at some of the findings for root causality. And one of the things about this brief, all too brief, right, kind of recap, I find it helpful to look at one of the ways the studies divide, right, and an interesting way that the studies divide is along what, rural findings of rural studies or studies that have a rural focus, and findings of studies that are looking at urban areas. And in each of the, as I go through like rural effects, urban dynamics, I've cited only just one study per line. There's many more studies, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just focusing on the one I like the best in effect, or found the most useful, perhaps. All right, so with rural effects and root causality, we find that economic inequality often has a significant and positive relationship with climate vulnerability. But economic inequality typically has a smaller effect than income levels. So when you look at what's making like the greatest contribution to vulnerability, it'll be the income level, right? But economic inequality also has an effect. And that the strength of this relationship varies by climate shock, right? So Rory et al. Find that rural Vietnamese households in areas with high inequality experience more adverse effects from droughts and floods, but the magnitude is stronger for droughts. And again, some of the kind of takeaways that I get from this examination of the work is that all shocks are bad in different ways, right? So understanding, and this has an impact for like kind of like the temporal factors, like how long is it going to take to get if you're going to get the the theoretical, the hypothesized result, how long do you wait before you expect to see it? All right, and then urban dynamics, right, differ. And I think that this is very interesting. So again, we have significant and positive association, but often inequality makes a greater contribution to vulnerability than poverty level. So this is different from rural studies. So in urban Brazil, for example, economic inequality contributes more to flood vulnerability than poverty rates, even after controlling for regional differences in levels of economic development. And a longitudinal study of urban India finds that the strength of this relationship decreases, the inequality vulnerability relationship decreases over time, and it increases by quite a bit, right? 38%. So this suggests that temporally, right, this is not going to be inequality might make a strong contribution, but this will vary over time, right? And so this needs other factors, right, that are time variant, could be playing a role. So then with feedback causality, we're looking at a very different type of approach. And so what we see here are usually probabilistic. So whereas with root causality, you're looking at studies that typically are trying to like reconstruct, right, like this relationship using what's happened in the past, and making a statement about that. With feedback causality, you're using information and then you're using it in a way, you're taking an approach that allows you to make some predictions about what's going to happen in the future, right? So in global integrated assessment models, microsimulation models predict changes in inequality under various climate change scenarios, right? So this is one. So the ways that they account for inequality and climate change differ. There's some national, subnational studies using CGE models, regression approaches, but they're in the minority. So models are incorporating income inequality by assigning greater weight to climate-related damages at lower income levels. This is one way that they account for inequality. And others use future socioeconomic scenarios, right, as a way of accounting for including inequality in the model. Climate vulnerability is integrated into the models by estimating the impact of temperature, precipitation changes on economic productivity, and modeled as climate-related economic damages or costs, right? So this is like a typical way. And so many of these studies are global in scope, although some are national. And probabilistic studies of feedback causality generally suggest that economic inequalities increase or will increase in the future as the poor are made poorer still, even by moderate climate change, while the highest income groups, right, suffer climate-related costs only under more extreme scenarios. As an aside, though, I think that we're realizing that those more extreme scenarios perhaps are not really extreme, like perhaps they are to be, anticipated, expected. But so extreme weather has also, been found to increase regional economic inequality by differential impacts on economic growth. But some of the studies that I'd like to just call attention to and kind of build on these findings, there is suggestion that climate change increases economic inequality, right? In one study, climate change reduces consumption of the poorest 20% of the world population, right, in many regions. And you see this like happening over time. Globally, climate change increases the number of people living in poverty with more pronounced effects when using socioeconomic scenarios characterized by higher initial levels of inequality. So the more unequal the society, at least the findings of this study, the more unequal the society is at the start, you know, the more you see climate vulnerability, you know, exacerbating inequality. And global warming has exacerbated between country inequality by 25%. And this is actually a pretty recent study. But these findings generally align with one another. In the national study that I'd like to point out, in Ethiopia, global warming scenarios result in up to 20% higher inequality. So they're finding that climate change and differential vulnerability increases economic inequality. But, you know, just this like, you know, small group of studies, right? This is like a handful of studies. You see that it's comparable, 20%, 25%, 20% higher inequality. So they're looking at different things using different measures, but, you know, it's, I think, suggestive, although there's too few to really, you know, to generalize from or draw any like, you know, firm conclusions from. But now we come to the twist. In the feedback studies in particular, our feedback causality studies, some of the findings, even published findings, are counterintuitive in a way that we'll talk a little bit about and explore. And this is kind of where I think that the real mystery is starting to play out. I also think that, you know, for every, you know, published study of counterintuitive finding or a non-finding, right, there's probably dozens and dozens, and that's maybe even an understatement, of, you know, work analyses that didn't reach publication. Because, you know, there is a bias towards a finding, right? But not only in this twist do you find some studies showing that there is no relationship between inequality and climate vulnerability, or climate vulnerability and inequality, but even more interesting for me, there's, you know, suggestions, hints that equity may have a dark side, right? So a counter narrative emerges, right, from a group of these studies, or like a subset of these studies, and that these studies are mainly national or subnational in scope, and they find that climate shocks may have income equalizing effects in some cases, right? And I think here we confront one of, like, you know, one of a big barrier, right? In that we think of income equalizing as being a positive thing, right? But in these studies, that's not necessarily the case, right? So when you see poverty decrease, like lower poverty, right, it's hard to view that as a bad finding, or, you know, to see the dark side in it. But when you see income equalizing effects, we probably should be paying more attention to a potential dark side. Anyway, so this is just 3 studies, including one of that I was involved in, to illustrate the dark side, right? In Bangladesh, Abdullah and a group of you know, co-authors examine household income inequality in Bangladesh 10 months after a cyclone. And they find that Gini scores fell by 64–65% in severe and high impact zones, while remaining unchanged in the low impact zone. And the losses for wealthier households in the study were disproportionately greater, right? And hence, you know, that's where the decline in inequality is coming from. Wealthier households lost assets such as farming equipment, and this resulted in lower income earning capacity, right, in the months following the cyclone. Where poorer households had fewer assets to lose, and also fewer assets to help smooth consumption, they had to resume income activities quickly after the event, right? And for this group, right, in this study, in this case, poorer households were mainly employed in manual labor, right? And so they find that among poorer households, income levels actually increase among the poorest post-cyclone, because they have fewer assets left to, you know, smooth consumption, right? And so they enter into the labor market. More people are entering into the labor market, spending more time on it. In contrast, wealthier households were trapped by social expectations associated with their previous levels of wealth, in that laboring work was seen to be beneath them, And so they didn't use the same coping strategies that were being employed by poorer households, and this particularly was true for women, right? Women from these households were not allowed to enter into the, or social expectations kept them from entering into the labor market. So people in all income groups relied on informal safety nets during this period, but the study found no evidence that social networks of the wealthy people proved more effective than those of poorer groups. Two other recent studies that use a regression approach also find evidence of dark equity. So Teed examines how rainfall variability affects asset inequality between and within 3 communities in rural Ethiopia using the tile index that's based on asset wealth, and finds no significant effects are observed for changes in overall asset inequality, but results indicate that drought in particular had inequality dampening effects on livestock holdings, and this operated by eroding livestock wealth among the upper 10th percent. And he refers to a dark side, he actually uses the term, of climate-induced inequality, and he suggests that more evenly distributed assets may result in higher health and nutritional inequities, right? So as inequality shrinks because the ceiling, the wealthy are like dropping closer to the floor, right, closer to the poor groups, that this could result in higher health and nutritional inequities as wealthier community members become less able to assist worse off neighbors during times of need. And in Mozambique, myself, Corey Matchis from the University of Florida, and Bendito Kungara from Michigan State, we examined changes in income inequality using the Gini coefficient, but also changes in polarization using the DARE polarization index for 8 Mozambican regions that experienced extreme weather between 2005 and 2008. During this time period, right, there were cyclones, 2 cyclones that occurred, a widespread drought occurred in the south, and then there was floods along, the 2 major river areas, so the Limpopo and the Zambezi. And we find that inequality increases in the aftermath of an extreme event in only 3 of these 8 regions, right? And part of this, we speculate, has to do with a lot of very context-specific factors. And so in the case of one region, the cyclone actually had a drought busting effect, in that it brought rain at a critical time period during the maize cycle, and it actually helped a lot of semi-subsistence farmers, right, and raise their income levels, right, so brought the floor a little closer to the ceiling, and that's why you see inequality declining in this case, right. So not generalizable, but showing the ways in which inequality operates in a tricky way, right. That, in that case that I'm talking about with the drought busting cyclone, that's the way you want to see inequality decrease, right. You want to see the poorest, right, the floor coming up, right, closer to the ceiling, the top. But we only found that in one region, right? In the other 3 cases, what we were finding was really that inequality was decreasing because the wealthier were losing ground, right? And so the ceiling dropping to the floor, right? So taken together, these findings suggest that climate vulnerability can have equalizing effects, but really, in some cases, they can improve the economic conditions in disadvantaged communities, but in some cases, it's because they're eroding the economic conditions, or, and all of these studies of the counter narrative, I should say, right, is looking at either income or some form of wealth, right, some sort of asset wealth. And then I want to call attention to one study. It's old, but it was really, I think it's still, very illuminating, right, very provocative. A cross-national study that looked at 2000 to 2200 finds that highest income groups eventually suffer climate-related costs under, again, they refer to it as most extreme climate change scenarios. But what Toll and his co-authors did was they had a Kuznets of inequality, right, under climate change, right, where they show that it keeps increasing until a certain point, right, along this very long time period, and then it starts to decrease because at that point the costs of climate change now have reached wealthier countries, right, and it's starting to, it's starting to hurt them enough, right, that it's, again, dropping them down, like closer to people who've been, hurt by inequality all along, right, or in the earlier phases. So dark, noisy equity, what are we looking at? Well, in part, what we're trying to show is that, as this figure illustrates, changes in, and this is looking at economic inequality, or, theoretical, Economic inequality under a dark equity scenario, you can see both groups experiencing declines in well-being, but inequality decreases as the better off experience more losses than the marginalized, right? And again, the better off here are denoted by alpha, delta for the poorest. The wavy line is being used to represent, we use it to represent the dynamic nature of well-being in households and communities, because access to resources, finances, political power, labor markets, all of these things varies temporally, right? And it's varying on a daily, monthly, seasonal, yearly scale. And this is going to, so I think it's more realistic to think of it this way, but the outcome in the dark equity is that inequality decreases, and that's because the wealthier lose more ground than the poor do. And part of this too is like, when you're looking at economic inequality, the poor often have less to lose, right? So proportionally, they might lose more. But when you're looking at an inequality metric, right, what you're going to see is, evidence of decreasing inequality, in part coming from kind of the erosion of the position of the people at the top of the distribution. And dark equity findings raise, numerous questions, I believe. One is, is this a short-term effect? And, the other, well, in this, qualitative approaches that examine changes in inequality immediately after a climate-related event, they may fail to capture longer-term processes by which individuals or households regain assets through the use of elite capture, of disaster recovery aid, exploitative labor contracts, and other mechanisms. And these mechanisms are very well discussed in the dynamic vulnerability literature. And part of this overall project, but I don't have time to go into today, has been to kind of merge the dynamic vulnerability literature, take insights from that to help us kind of elaborate what we know from the quantitative literature, and vice versa on that, right? But the scarcity of longitudinal studies makes it difficult to assess how widespread this dark equity dynamic may be. And also, I wonder if this could be a rural effect to some degree. Like if we see this because if you're looking at less economically developed countries and you're focusing on, or you're using rural surveys, focusing on rural areas, one of the things is that, the real wealthy, for example, in Mozambique, I would argue, are living in the cities. But, their experiences are not being captured by those surveys that, that I am using, right? Or I was using in that past analysis. So the wealthy in my sample were still not the wealthiest, right? And probably, if you think back to the theory, not the people whose interests are being better served by policies, right? So it's, again, one thing to reflect on and consider as we move forward. So in terms of summarizing the limited evidence, the limited is still very useful, very provocative, very, very interesting evidence that we have on, both directions of this relationship. I think we can say that there's relevant, from what exists, there's relatively robust support of root causality, that inequality, right, increases climate vulnerability. And I think we also can say, that the findings for the reverse relationship are more mixed, right? So climate vulnerability impacting inequality or increasing inequality, right? And that's, because of the dynamic vulnerability, kind of subset, because of the dark equity subset of the literature that I, just briefly, discussed and gave a few examples, right? But the big takeaway for me and for others that I'm working with on this and I've talked to about this, right, is that if climate change, right, it's kind of a theory building point, if climate change ultimately harms everyone, and I think that there's good reasons to think that it does, right, or that it will. If climate change ultimately harms everyone, then in theory, this will eventually decrease economic inequality, right? I'm not willing to say all other forms of inequality, but decrease economic inequality. But this is not a good thing, even in, if all other things being equal, less inequality is better. It runs into some problems, particularly because of the studies, not just the ones looking quantitatively, trying to measure inequalities impacts or climate vulnerabilities impacts, but the dynamic vulnerability literature that, social supports come under a lot of strain as, the wealthiest segment of society, whatever society you're looking at, experiences losses. And so, you can actually see kind of a decline in well-being for everybody that's markedly worse. And this is assuming, right, that the social hierarchies, you know, that lead to, you know, the uneven distribution of resources, right, remain unchanged by climate change. And that's a big assumption. But I still think, right, that this means that, you know, decreasing economic inequality of a certain type is what we want, but not just in general, right? Whereas I think we can still say, like, just decreasing poverty, right, is what we want. Decreasing economic inequality, we have to be more careful. And we have to, I think, be a little bit more normative and speak about what kinds of, you know, inequality, what types of inequality we want to see decline, and how we want to see them decline. So future research in terms of rethinking theory and methods, I think that, you know, viewing disadvantage as a multi-dimensional condition is really necessary, even if we're using metrics, right, that are capturing economic inequality. I think when we, you know, interpretively engage with our findings, right, you know, when we analytically engage with them, right, I think that we can still, like, you know, discuss multi-dimensional, like, aspects of disadvantage and poverty and inequality. And here I think of Amartya and the work that he's done, right? I also think taking more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches would be very useful. Employing alternative and traditional inequality metrics. I think it's important to use the traditional metrics. And so I'm not of the group, right, that criticizes the Gini, although I think it's important to recognize, like, you know, where it falls short. I like the use of traditional inequality metrics because it really enhances comparability with, you know, studies that have been done in the past. But that doesn't mean that you have to limit yourself to just using the traditional metrics, right? And I think that we should be employing more alternative metrics so you can kind of bring those into dialogue with the traditional ones, right? So that allows some sort of continuity with past empirical work, while also exploring some more of the nuances of inequality. And my screen has frozen, and I apologize for that. Okay. We want to reconsider the focus on rural regions, and that's just, you know, kind of going back to, like, are the, you know, the people of power included in your sample, right? If you're going to really be testing the theory that, you know, wealth translates into political power, you know, are those people that are, you know, politically powerful in a way that's going to, like, you know, determine access to public resources, are they captured in the rural samples that we're looking at? And prioritizing longitudinal analyses, I would just end this by saying that the main gap in the studies that we have now is, you know, the lack of kind of longitudinal assessments. And, you know, they're difficult for a lot of reasons. You know, I won't go into them now. I mean, there's reasons why we don't have them, but I do think that in terms of, like, you know, funding priorities for agencies, you know, funding longitudinal analyses, I think are critical, right? That priority is critical. And then finally, my part 2 of acknowledgements. I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the UN DESA Climate Change Resilience and Opportunity for Reducing Inequalities, their World Economic and Social Survey from 2016. I was also a participant, and really that got me kind of interested in really kind of interrogating or parsing out the theoretical pathways, right, that underlie that, you know, the assumed relationships, and really kind of, instead of just lamenting the lack of, you know, a really, you know, large body of work like you see with poverty and climate change, to try and understand better why there's a scarcity, and then kind of moving forward how to address that, and, you know, with the ultimate result being, you know, more empirical work on this in this area. So I'd like to thank everyone. My email is there in case people, like, are watching this while I'm not, or not in real time, and want to email me with any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And also, even now, if someone has questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Julie. We do have plenty of time for some questions and answers. So if you go ahead into your dashboard, as an attendee, you have the ability to type a question, or you can use the raise hand functionality and I can unmute you so you can talk to Julie directly and ask your question on the mic. We do have a hand raised.
All right.
Nikita Imani, did you still want to ask your question? I've gone ahead and unmuted you, so feel free to go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Fantastic. I'm Dr. Nikita Imani. I'm in Department of Black Studies. I'm a sociologist and political scientist by training, and I do research on Africana communities globally. And the thing I thought was kind of interesting, I really liked your future directions for research and talking about cross-disciplinary because of, in our field, we've been doing a lot of stuff on international income inequality and poverty. And I was thinking before we advance the thesis as to how elite classes or poor classes are affected by climate change, there's some other variables we need to consider. For example, I was working in a rural community in Central Africa where you had one cultural group that was primarily hunting and gathering, and another social group that was primarily a fishing kind of group. And the effects of climate change, obviously both were going to be affected, and both of these groups in absolute economic terms were considerably less well off certainly than any of the elites in the society. However, there's another variable that we consider very important called quality of life, and your perception of inequality and your perception of poverty has to do with the extent to which your quality of life was disrupted. And so what we found was that in the short term, um, the fishing areas were going to be much more affected by some of the immediate climate change variables than say the hunting and gathering. So in that context, if you simply took absolute aggregate effects, both groups would be affected adversely and certainly more adversely than the elites. But in terms of their day-to-day living and the things they considered culturally and socially important, one group was going to be affected less than the other. So I was kind of curious, in all of these measures and these aggregates, does anybody consider that perception of poverty, perception of inequality, sometimes when we move out of kind of a Western materialistic context and absolute calculations of economic wealth, sometimes has to do with the capacity to maintain a certain way of life. And if you can do that to a greater or lesser degree, you consider your effects greater or lesser. I'm wondering if there's any attention to that in the literature as you saw it.
So two things to that, and you bring up a really interesting point. And it's also, it's one of these like kind of like sticky points, because I mean, I don't think you're doing this, but you always want to be careful that you don't romanticize poverty, right? Like, oh,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You weren't doing that.
Yeah.
I know you weren't, but it's one of those things that you're like, okay, when you start to do like engage with it. But first, the dynamic vulnerability literature, like the empirical but qualitatively empirical studies, I think that they do a better job of it. Case studies, right? Case study work, right? So not these kind of like global level models or like kind of national assessments. Pay much more attention to these like, kind of these details that you're talking about. Broad ways of engaging with it. I don't see a lot of it, although I think that there needs to be. It does make me think a bit of like Amartya Sen and his work with when he's talking about inequality and inequality of what, and saying like,
Right.
In a way, it's kind of a cautionary, right? Adaptive preference. People might become like adapted to, just because they're happier with less doesn't mean they deserve, they don't deserve more kind of a, but given like the size of the gaps, right? I think that, like small steps are still important steps. I think though, what would be nice and what I don't see in the literature, and I'm speaking here more about like the quantitative studies, right? Is at least, but some of them do it, but not a lot, an acknowledgement of this, right?
Yeah.
And there's one, like the Hellgate paper does state this, like, we're only looking at economic, we realize that there's a lot of like details that are happening, like, the context is important. I mean, they don't go as far as you do to say like, kind of this like consumption, this idea that, you have to be consuming in order to be happy. Even the idea, I'll even take it a step further, right? That you will be able to, right? Keep consuming. We might have to like redefine like having. This is one of the things where I think would just be beautiful to actually, in terms of like interdisciplinary, to have like more kind of humanists involved in this, historians, philosophers, But a project like that seems, I would want to manage it, but I'd love to participate in it. But
understood.
But I guess to sum it, there's not in the studies that I was focusing on for the quantitative kind of like, quantifying the strength of the relationship, not a lot, no, because they're trying more, like the goal of their project, I think, broadly, these studies like is to come up with something generalizable, right? And so they
Right.
sacrifice like the other side of it. And I think probably like one way, right, to kind of address that would be, as I said, right, that there'd be some acknowledgement that, you know, even though I think that, you know, people often think that that's like just known, I think that we're probably entering into like a time where it's just, it would be very beneficial to have that be made more explicit.
Right. Yeah,
But
I'm thinking culture. You know, we have one of our most important variables in our discipline is culture. And the problem sometimes with the aggregation is that as we incorporate variables to be surrogates for dimensions of economics or dimensions of politics, we sometimes omit culture. And for people, certainly traditional people, indigenous people, if we're going to focus on rural areas, culture is front and center. And it always bothers me sometimes to see people come in and not consider that in their formulation of testing variables and hypotheses.
do you think, I mean, do you agree that something, I mean, I guess better than nothing would be kind of an acknowledgement that this is being done? Kind of a
Oh yeah,
recognition.
I mean I think acknowledging it, but what I'm saying is that
But doing it is
we
bad. Okay.
right, I'm just saying that when you formulate the variable, just as you have surrogate variables for other dimensions of whether you use wealth, income, land ownership, I mean, we know how to do that with variables. There are similar surrogate variables for relevance to culture, inappropriate or appropriate technologies, rate of growth, those kinds of things. They're there, but I find it interesting that sometimes there's in the pursuit of, as you said, generalizability and consistent with existing research, we kind of don't do as much in terms of that cross-cultural thing, and that leads in many cases in many of these areas to an allegation of kind of ethnocentric myopia, in which we're saying that I think that having triple the income would automatically be better. There are clearly societies where that simplistic assumption is, if not dead wrong, seriously problematic.
True, true.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's been very enlightening.
No, thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. Really appreciate it, Nikita. All right. I don't see any other hands up at the moment, but we do have a couple of questions that have come into through the attendee chat here. Let's see. Oh, it disappeared. I guess not.
People being very easy on
Let's
me.
see. Let's see if we have any other hands raised. I don't see any other hand raised or questions. Oh, it looks like something came in the chat. Let's see the chat. Oh, let's see. Can you describe the challenges of obtaining the necessary economic data from the developing countries like Mozambique?
Okay, well, yeah. Okay, so there are definitely challenges. So, okay, first of all data are dirty. Like, I started off like, my work with Robin Lashenko actually, using data from like the U.S. Census of Manufacturers, and that data was dirty in its own way, and like other data. So in terms of a question of accessibility, accessing the data is often like a little bit more esoteric, perhaps. In Mozambique, for example, like, so you can get access to the US data, like you can find out how you're supposed to do that on the web, kind of a thing. For other countries, it's often useful, even if in theory, right, it's supposed to be publicly available, it's often useful to have, collaborations or existing, like, even if not like, like co-publications, just, colleagues, right, in the country. And they help you get access to the data. So that's actually Bendito Quinguara, who's one of the co-authors on the piece that I was actually talking about today in this presentation. He was with Michigan State that collected the data that we were using, right? So it's called the TIA, but it's like the Mozambican Agricultural Survey. Anyway, I give all this information because like every kind of data access story probably has a little like kind of a similar, you know, I got access to those data, you know, through, you know, colleagues, Mozambican colleagues, and then, you know, in working with them, you know, was better able to like, you know, understand to use them, you know, to kind of like, you know, leverage their strengths. So I think accessing is one thing, right? And that's difficult to say, you know, I could tell you how to go about and who to talk to for Mozambique. It would be much more, you know, difficult to, you know, to transfer like those techniques, right, to another country. But I would just go a little even further, right, in my response to say that once you have those data, I can't think of a situation that I've ever been in where it wasn't beneficial for me to actually have like in-country collaborators. So people from like, just because their interpretive insights are always so valuable, and you know, and they can like spot crazy things in the data. Like when the data is misbehaving, I might not see it. You know, like no drop off in goat ownership, right, would signal something to, you know, I'm thinking of a time when I was working, this was with Namibian data, but my Namibian collaborator, Alphonse Masamani, was like, oh no, there's something there, like there should be less, like there was a big, you know, epidemic, things that I wouldn't know, right? And yeah, so when you access the data, if you do it through like establishing like relationships with people, you know, that are working in the country, or, you know, scholars from that country, even if they're at US institutions or, you know, elsewhere, I would encourage people to not let it stop there. And then accessing data just occurred to me, you know, if you see somebody who's publishing with those data, I would email them. And I get emails from people who are asking about like accessibility, you know, in terms of Mozambican data. I never give it to them directly because I have to sign a disclosure, but, you know, I can put them in touch with Bendito or, you know, other people who do have the authority to give it. So if you see something that was written using data that you would like to use, emailing the, you know, the corresponding author on that to ask, like, you know, could you give me any advice on who I should contact, right, in order to access it? As long as I think that they're as long as you're clear that you're not expecting them to just email it to you, because often, you know, but people can't. I think that would probably be the strategy I'd recommend. And then whoever gives you those data, like, you know, try and become friends with them, right? And hopefully it'll lead to a collaboration, because then I think your use of the data, you know, it's much more insightful, fruitful.
Julie, there is a comment from Andrew, I believe, based on what you were just talking about, and it's more of a comment than a question, but this is why research with indigenous communities need to be included in the research design and allowed to define the variables that matter to them. That will in turn help them build capacity, govern their lands and resources so that they can define the vulnerabilities.
No, that is absolutely true. And that is not, you know, my response didn't capture that. So I appreciate that response, because I mean, working with, you know, collaborating with people like Mozambican scholars, because I'm using Mozambican data, even Mozambican scholars who actually were like, you know, pivotal in like collecting those data and, you know, designing those surveys, that's not the same thing as talking to the people from whom, you know, whose information, right, was collected. I mean, that is something that is still missing in most surveys, and I think it's, I mean, it's possible when you're doing your own field work, right, designing your own surveys, but that's not enough. We want that kind of, you know, insight to already be included in these data sets that are being shared, right, nationally representative data sets and the like. I'm not sure how we get there. I mean, but just because I don't know that doesn't mean that, you know, we don't need it, right? And I mean, I think including, you know, the voices of people so that they can define vulnerability, those types of partnerships and collaborations, I don't see a lot of them. Definitely not for like the types of like data sets when I'm using like nationally representative data sets. And so, you know, there's an area where a lot of like, you know, that deserves a lot of attention and a lot of our energy.
Then just a follow-up comment was, speaking from a U.S. perspective, we care about treaty rights and protections of treaty land, sovereignty, and self-determination. These topics typically are left out of climate studies that I've found. That's also from Andrew.
Yeah, no, I mean, the politics, I mean, there's like, it's interesting. There's an acknowledgement that there are these political pathways through which, you know, these relationships like inequality and vulnerability operate, right? And that's discussed a lot in the theoretical literature, and, you know, on vulnerability. But in the actual, in the empirical work, well, I should say, in the studies that I was looking at for this, this component, right, of the project that I was presenting on today, you don't see a lot of discussion about the politics or like, the land rights and things. The dynamic vulnerability studies do much better at that. And I think that, this is something that is another reason why we really want to kind of like bridge the gap between those two types of literature, right? I do feel like it's interesting that, the people that are doing like the more like, like economic, dare I say, like kind of studies, and the people that are doing the dynamic vulnerability, right? You're almost getting in a divide that's kind of like the quantitative qualitative divide a little, right? But it's getting better, I think. But like getting some collaborative, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, transdisciplinary even would be bringing people, right, that know like these local areas, right, and have, can represent like the voices of the subjects even better. But, it's when you start to like think of the dynamic vulnerability and help you kind of make sense of, the more like econometric studies that you get this sense that really there's something big missing, and that's the power dynamic. And you can say that there's a political pathway, but there needs to be a lot more unpacking of that, I think.
All right, Andrew, thank you for the great comments. Appreciate it. And Andrew, in turn, thanks you, Julie, for the discussion.
Oh, no, thank you very much. And so hopefully if people are seeing this another part in time and they have a question, they're free to email me.
Great, great. So, Phil, I just want to thank you and your leadership in the section and bringing Julie to AGU for this great webinar. Julie, thank you so much for your time that you've given to the section, to AGU, and on this topic. Really appreciate it. To everyone that's joined, thank you all for joining. Again, we've recorded this, so it'll be up on our website for later viewing. And hope to see everybody in just a few weeks in San Francisco.
All right, bye.
Yep, thanks, Julie. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Phil. Take care.